So, I haven't always been a church minister. Actually, over the years, I've had quite a few different jobs. I did the obligatory paper round when I was 14. And of course, I spent a number of years working in fast food. I also spent some time as a youth worker, both in a Christian and secular context. But one of my most memorable jobs was as something called a student support officer in a school. Sounds very fancy. In reality, I guess I was something of a naughty child wrangler. It was my job to deal with those students who were, shall we say, unable to access traditional educational methods. Most days I would arrive in school, the bell would ring, and I would have about 10 minutes, I'd say, to check my emails before I'd be called to a classroom and asked to remove a child that had been playing up. And I would have to take them to this little room where I would sit with them for the rest of the lesson and try and get them to do some kind of work. And it was a memorable job because I got to meet some really interesting characters. For example, there was this one lad who would always turn up late every single day. And I'm not talking about like 10 to 15 minutes. I'm talking about like just before lunch kind of late. We couldn't get him in. We sent letter after letter after letter home. We even got the police involved at one point, but it was all to no avail. Until one day my boss said, well, why don't you go around his house and see if you can get him in? So I turned up at the front door and I knocked. And his mum answered. And she said, what? I said, is Dave coming to school today? It wasn't his real name. She said, I don't know. I said, well, you know, he's been late every single day of this term. And, you know, your education's really important, blah, blah, blah. And she said, yeah, what do you expect me to do about it? I can't get him out of bed. You try. And then she sort of ushers me into their house and just points at a door at the top of the stairs. So I tentatively walk up the stairs and knock on that door. And of course, there's no answer. And she calls up, you have to go in. At which point, I have this moment where I realise that I am for sure in breach of every single safeguarding rule there is. You shouldn't go into students' bedrooms. So I sort of have to sort of slightly push the door and go, Dave, are you coming to school today? It's your student support officer, Dan. And I did get a response, but I really don't want to put it on video. It wasn't very polite, shall we say. But there are all sorts of crazy scenarios like that. I remember another occasion where I received a phone call about a girl, we'll call her Lucy, who I often spent time with out of lessons. And she was on her way to school. She was on the bus, but I was told that I would need to meet her as soon as the bus arrived. To which I thought, oh, what has she done now? I mean, school hasn't even started yet. How can she be in this much trouble already? Has she, I don't know, assaulted the bus driver or put another student through the window? Anyway, I went to meet her. And as I got there, she was being led off the bus by another student and her eyes were closed. And when I asked what the problem was, she proceeded to tell me that her younger sibling had replaced her eye drops with super glue for a laugh. And now her eyes were stuck shut. I couldn't reach her mum, so I had to take her to hospital. Thankfully, though, they were able to cut the glue away and her eyes were fine. I had another student who was so troubled that on one occasion he stole a hammer from the workshop and was threatening to bash a teacher's head in. Yeah, that was a fun morning. Often he would just run away in the middle of the day and I would spend hours searching for him around this huge lake that was situated just by the school. He was so difficult that I found myself breathing a sigh of relief on those days that he didn't attend. And whenever he got in trouble, you know, we would always try and phone his parents, but they just never answered. Until one day we did manage to get hold of his father and he agreed to come in for a meeting with the principal and myself. And I'll never forget how that father spoke to his son that day. It was absolutely disgusting. He treated him as though he was something he'd stepped in on the street. The way he berated him and tore him down in front of us. All of his behaviour in school, it suddenly made sense. He wasn't this naughty child anymore. He was this kid that was hurt and broken. I never looked at him the same way again. All of my students actually suffered various forms of trauma and neglect, much of which would be inappropriate for me to share with you today. But the more time that I spent with them, the more I saw the pain and the hurt behind the behaviour. You know, a lot of the staff, they simply knew them by their behaviour. They saw them as naughty, but I had the burden of knowledge. I can remember going to this meeting actually once of all the local head teachers, because when students are difficult and before they get expelled, schools often try something called a managed move. It's where essentially they send a student to another school in the hope that this new environment will be enough to fix the problems. But of course, no school wants to accept a naughty student, and so they end up doing swaps. They hold these meetings where they trade difficult students. I'll take your persistent absentee if you take our disruptive influence, that sort of thing. And essentially what happens in these meetings is that these children are reduced to their worst attributes. These children are seen as problems to solve, not people to be loved. And that's not to be disparaging towards schools or teaching staff, because I know many of them care very deeply about their students and they do everything to keep them in education. Most of them also work really hard to see the child behind the behaviour. It's a difficult job. But I left student support because I didn't feel I could do anything to really help these kids. I felt as though I was trying to put a plaster on a gaping wound. So I went from being a student support worker in a high school to being a family support worker for social services. And I ended up working for the care, planning and court team, whose job it is to support families who have been or are going through the legal process that happens when children are taken from their homes. And that was hard. That was really hard, because there are many children that are growing up in the most horrendous circumstances. And I'm not going to talk about those stories with you today. That simply wouldn't be fair to those kids that I work with. But one of the problems that social services had, and I think still has, is that once children are removed from their homes, there simply aren't enough places to send them. Often those that are looking to adopt want babies. I love that there are a number of folk in this church that have adopted children. That's so special, so precious. But often these kids end up in temporary care, or they're moved from foster carer to foster carer until they're 16 and can live in supporting housing complexes on their own. And I can remember on one occasion viewing a document which contained photos of children currently looking for a home, and it kind of broke me. It's just page after page of photos of children, some on their own, many with brothers and sisters, all without a family, without anyone to love them. And again, I had this sense that these kids had been reduced to problems to be solved rather than people to be loved. And I'm not, again, wanting to be disparaging to those who work in social care. I know many of them care ever so deeply, and it's such a difficult job. But what I came to see is that the kids I worked with in schools and in social services were suffering because their sense of value and worth had been called into question by the circumstances they found themselves in. Many of them, they didn't know that they were loved or even lovable. They had come to believe certain things about themselves because it was all they'd ever been told. You know, if a child hears enough times that they're naughty, they'll believe you. And I don't even think you have to say it that many times. If a child hears or comes to understand that they are worthless, it becomes their identity. If a child is moved from home to home to home, they will believe that they're not wanted. And if being a church minister has taught me anything, it's that it's not just kids. Adults too can very quickly come to believe things about themselves because of the situation that they find themselves in. We've been having a lot of conversations recently as a church through our community chaplains with folk that are in the most dire of circumstances. Adults that don't know that they are loved because no one in their life is telling them that they are. People who are so lonely. People who feel that they're on their own. People that have come to see themselves as a problem to be solved and not a person to be loved. It's heartbreaking. And it's not a new issue either. In the Gospels, we find many people who are portrayed as this problem, this issue to be solved, rather than a person to be loved. On one occasion, there were some children that were brought to Jesus, and the disciples, they tried to keep them at arm's length. They were not told what they said, but I imagine it was something like, "Oh, no, keep them away. They're too sticky. That one's got snot coming out of his nose." But Jesus called them close. He blessed them. He prayed for them. He said, "The kingdom of heaven is theirs." On another occasion, there was this woman who had been caught in the act of adultery. Presumably the guy had ran off. But the teachers of the law and the Pharisees, they used her as this object, this thing, this issue of disrepute to try and trap Jesus. They said, "Oh, should we stone her as the law of Moses tells us to?" Jesus turned it back on them. He said, "Let the one who is without sin cast the first stone." And he turned to her and he said, "Look, no one here condemns you, and neither do I. Go and live your life differently." On another occasion, there was a woman who came and anointed Jesus' feet with perfume. But Simon, who owned the house where they were at that time, he looked at her with disgust. He thought to himself, if Jesus knew the kind of woman that this was, he would say something. All he saw was this woman's sin and shame, but Jesus turned towards her and commended her. He praised her for her actions. He forgave her sins. He pronounced her saved. And there's many stories like that, but there's one in particular from Mark chapter 5 that I just want to share with you today. Jesus was on his way to the home of someone important, a leader of a synagogue, and he was going there to help because this leader's daughter was dying. It was this very dramatic scene, and the crowds that he were with, they all wanted to see what would happen, and so they followed along. And in the crowd, there was a woman who had been bleeding for 12 years. 12 years. It says in verse 26 that she suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. Her ailment came to consume her whole life, all of her money, all of her time, and yet she still suffered. And he goes on to say in verse 27, when she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak because she thought, if I can just touch his clothes, I'll be healed. But why not simply ask for help? I mean, Jesus was a pretty cool dude, right? You know, he helped a lot of people. He helped most of those that asked him. Well, I think this woman was someone who saw herself as a problem to be solved and not a person to be loved. You see, her constant bleeding, it put her at odds with the purity codes written in Leviticus 15, which were especially harsh towards women. Both she and anyone who touched her would be considered unclean, which meant that in her culture, no one would have wanted anything to do with her. And to make matters worse, Jesus was currently traveling with the leader of the synagogue, right? He was surrounded by this crowd of people. And so perhaps she thought to herself, you know, I'm too much of a problem to warrant any face-to-face time. You know, I don't want to make things awkward for him, especially from the leader of the synagogue. I'm unclean. I'm unworthy of speaking to him. I'm clearly not going to be wanted here. And so she keeps herself covered, and she thinks if I could just catch the corner of his cloak, then maybe that will be enough. And it is. It says in verse 29 that immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. But that's not the end of the story, because Jesus stops. I sort of assumed that the crowd bump into him, and he says, "Who touched my clothes?" And the disciples are like, mate, come on, are you joking? There's like 100 people here. Like, these 25 people have probably all touched you in the last 25 minutes. What's the hold up? Come on, it's a girl dying. Let's go. Jesus is like, no, shh. Someone here touched me. I felt it. He could have let it go. Could have carried on. But he didn't. And then in verse 33, it says, the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. And he said to her, and this is so beautiful, he said, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. In that moment, in front of everyone, the leader of the synagogue included, he honors her. He calls her daughter. He commends her for her faith. He blesses her. He loves her, and he gives her new hope for the future. He begins to help her see herself in a whole new light as this precious daughter. And that's the point that I want to get to today. You are not a problem to be solved. You are a child of God. You are a beloved daughter. You are a beloved son. You are not the sum of your issues or a product of your mistakes. You are not unlovely, unlovable, unworthy, or even unwanted, but beautiful in the eyes of God. And I know that there is a lot in this world that will try to convince you otherwise. People will mistreat you. People will use you. People will neglect you, abandon you. People will leave you feeling beaten and broken and hurt and suffering. But that's not who you are. It's not who you are. 1 John 3 verse 1 says this, see what great love the Father has lavished on us, that we should be called children of God. And that, it says, that is what we are. The reason the world does not know us is that it did not know him. Please don't let others define your worth. Let the fact that you are a beloved child of God, so beloved, in fact, that Christ died for you, define who you are and how you love those around you. People, everyone, are not problems to be solved. They are children of God. You are a child of God.
You unravel me with a melody. You surround me with the song of deliverance from my enemies, till all my fears are gone, and I'm no longer a slave to fear, for I am a child of God. I'm no longer a slave to fear, for I am a child of God. From my mother's womb, you have chosen me. Your love has called my name. I've been born again into your family.